North America's English colonies were frustrated. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, the British were in massive debt. The money had been spent in defense of the colonies, and the thousands of troops now stationed in the colonies were there to protect the lives and property of the colonists. The British therefore determined that it would increase its enforcement of existing taxes on the colonists and impose additional taxes as well. The increased taxes, as well as the increase in involvement by Parliament in the internal affairs of the colonies, and the lack of colonial representation in Parliament, all served to create the atmosphere of the Revolutionary period. The colonists' call for liberty were in direct contrast to the growing number of Africans and African Americans that the colonists held in bondage. Slavery was one of several key issues in the Revolutionary period, with partisans on both sides of the Atlantic decrying the slave trading or slave owning practices of the other. Would American independence move the states closer to the abolition of slavery? Or would the break from Britain mean even harsher conditions for American slaves? This and more as we rise up from slavery.
Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
The British considered themselves to be the freest society that had ever existed. And yet, they controlled the Atlantic slave trade, enslaved millions of Africans in their colonies in North America and the West Indies. And they allowed the practice of slavery in England itself. Britons had a powerful sense of personal liberty and rule of law. They believed no man, not even the king, was above the law. All British subjects and colonial Americans took great pride in their freedom and in Britain's reputation as the land of liberty. The incongruity of slavery playing a substantial role in a land of liberty would be crystallized by a legal decision in London that would send tremors across the Atlantic. When he was 9 years old, a West African boy was enslaved and sold to European slave traders. He survived the Middle Passage across the Atlantic and arrived in Virginia in 1749. He now had an English name, Somerset. Somerset was purchased by a young Scottish merchant, Charles Stuart. Stuart had an office and warehouse in Norfolk, Virginia, and he made Somerset his personal servant. In that role, Somerset was well treated and interacted with a relatively wide range of people, both black and white. Stuart received compliments on Somerset's abilities, and when Stuart moved first to Quebec and later, in October 1769, to London, he took Somerset with him. As he'd done in Norfolk, Somerset made friends quickly in his new home. In London, he found a small but thriving black community. This community included free blacks, slaves working for colonial masters, much like Somerset's, and former slaves who had been freed by their masters. Somerset had been in London not quite 2 years when he was baptized into the Christian faith and took the first name James. There were some Britons at that time who believed that baptism alone could be grounds for freeing a slave, or at least provide support for his being freed. It was also true that Somerset was longing for freedom himself. In October 1771, 2 years after arriving in London, Somerset left his master's service, never to return. Stuart was angered and offended by Somerset's decision. He posted notices for Somerset's capture, and by the end of October, Somerset was in chains. Placed on a ship bound for Jamaica, where he was to be sold to work on the brutal sugar plantations, Somerset was rescued by the godparents who had stood for him at baptism. Thomas Walken, Elizabeth Cade, and John Morrow petitioned the court for a writ of habeas corpus, stating that Somerset was being held on a ship against his will. Chief Justice Lord Mansfield ordered that Somerset be released until a hearing could be held on the legality of his imprisonment, more than 7 months away. Rather than take that as an opportunity to flee, Somerset visited the abolitionist Granville Sharp to prepare his case. Sharp had helped other slaves obtain their freedom in similar cases. In those instances, Lord Mansfield had talked the slave owners into releasing the slave without him having to render a judgment on the case. Mansfield did not want to rule on the legality of one man enslaving another, for a simple reason. He could see no protection for it under the law. Such a ruling could lead to the eventual destruction of the slave trade, which brought much wealth into Britain. There was nothing in the written or positive law that would allow it. The practice itself, though rare in England, had existed for a long time and could therefore arguably be considered legal under common law. There were many on both sides of the Atlantic who believed that this decision would abolish slavery. The Chief Justice had declared that slavery had no justification under the law of England. The decision did not address slavery in the colonies, where positive law did indeed describe the rights of masters over their slaves, nor did it impact the Atlantic slave trade. Dozens of articles reported the Somerset case in the colonies. Southern slave owners feared that if Parliament decided to support the Somerset decision by outlawing slavery, their entire society could be in danger. The colonies had all been established under the authority of the king and authorized to form colonial legislatures. Each colony could create its own laws with the condition that those laws be not repugnant to the laws of England. Mansfield's pronouncement of the odious nature of slavery gave cause to worry that Parliament could one day decide that the colony's slavery codes were indeed repugnant. If so, the colonists, lacking any representation in Parliament, would have no say in the matter. Or, if the British were unwilling to outlaw slavery, because of the wealth slave labor produced, Parliament could instead impose taxes on the sale of slaves. This was one more grievance to add to the growing stack of problems that the colonists had with the British government. In 1762, King George III had vetoed a Virginia law regarding debt payments, a case that brought Patrick Henry to prominence. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 declared that the land west of the Appalachian Mountains, recently won from the French during the French and Indian War, to be off limits to settlement by the colonists. Colonial governments could not grant settlement rights to the land. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, and the Townshend Act of 1767 had further outraged colonists. The offense was not the size of the taxes, which were relatively small, but the fact that they were imposed by a government on the other side of the ocean, in which the colonists had no representation. Cementing the sense that colonial self-government was in danger of disappearing completely, the 1766 Declaratory Act stated that Parliament had the authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In March 1770, a mob in Boston gathered around a group of British soldiers. The mob grew larger and angrier, graduating from throwing snowballs to hurling rocks. When one soldier was clubbed to the ground, the British opened fire on the crowd. Of the 5 civilians killed in what was called the Boston Massacre, one was Crispus Attucks, who may well have been an escaped slave. Few details are known of Attucks and his life prior to the massacre, but he would be hailed as the first martyr of the Revolutionary War. White Southern planters were the wealthiest group in the North American colonies. They owned resources worth more than twice that of propertied men in the northern colonies. But that wealth was tied up in their labor and land. If Parliament ever freed the slaves, Southern planters would be wiped out, losing the value of the slaves, and with no labor force, the products of the land. Slaves also provided a hedge against financial loss. If a crop failed, planters could sell excess slaves to recoup their funds necessary to plant for the next season. In March 1773, the Virginia House of Burgesses resolved to form a committee of correspondence. Massachusetts had formed its own committee 5 months earlier, and the other colonies quickly joined. The purpose of the committees was to organize resistance to British encroachments. Eventually, these committees, bringing the colonies together, would form the government in opposition to Britain in the Revolutionary War. The Tea Act of 1773 was the beginning of the end of British rule in North America. Though the act actually lowered the price of legal tea, the colonists resisted the continuing taxation without representation. Their outrage culminated in the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773. Parliament responded with the Intolerable Acts, which, among other things, brought Massachusetts government under the direct control of British government. Thomas Jefferson included the slave trade and slavery itself as one of the unjust practices forced upon America by Great Britain. In 1774, Jefferson wrote a pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America.
The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves it is necessary to exclude all further importations from Africa. Yet our repeated attempts to effect this by prohibitions and by imposing duties which might amount to a prohibition have been hitherto defeated by His Majesty's negative, thus preferring the immediate advantages of a few British corsairs to the lasting interests of the American states, and to the rights of human nature, deeply wounded by this infamous practice.
Jefferson was not alone in calling for an end to the slave trade, from both a moral standpoint and as a means of resisting Britain, which gained so much in its odious trade. In July 1774, a set of resolutions was adopted by a committee in Fairfax County, Virginia, that included George Washington and George Mason among its members. The Fairfax County Resolves, as they are called, highlighted a number of the concerns that were leading colonists to seek independence from Britain. Among them was the slave trade, the committee stating, "We take this opportunity of declaring our most earnest wishes to see an entire stop forever put to such a wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade." When the First Continental Congress met in October 1774, they used the Fairfax County Resolves as the starting point for a resolution signed by delegates from all of the colonies. The Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress included a range of issues, but one was the Atlantic slave trade.
We will neither import nor purchase any slave imported after the first day of December next, after which time we will wholly discontinue the slave trade, and will neither be concerned in it ourselves, nor will we hire our vessels, nor sell our commodities or manufactures to those who are concerned in it.
Individual colonies had sought to end importation of African slaves in the past. Pennsylvania passed bills prohibiting slave trading in 1712, 1714, and 1717, but they were disallowed by the Crown. Massachusetts passed a similar bill in 1774, which was also disallowed. Virginia had opposed the Atlantic slave trade since 1772. Part of their opposition was due to the horrific nature of the Middle Passage. Part was due to their concerns that the slave population in Virginia had already grown dangerously large. And part was due to the fact that if no further slaves were imported from Africa, future slave purchase by South Carolina and Georgia would be from Virginia planters. Regardless of the reason, though the individual colonial governments were unable to outlaw the Atlantic slave trade under British rule, the prohibition by the Continental Congress would stand throughout the war. And war was beginning to look inevitable to some. The Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, responded to the formation of Virginia's Committee of Correspondence by dissolving the Colonial Assembly. Tensions in the colonies rose and then boiled over. Militia companies began to organize within the colonies and to seek out arms and equipment. On April 19, 1775, the shot heard round the world was fired in the battles of Lexington and Concord. The next day, before news could have even reached Virginia, Lord Dunmore ordered Royal Marines to remove the gunpowder stored in a magazine in Williamsburg and to take it to a Royal Navy ship. The colonists discovered the Marines as they were transporting the gunpowder, and the local militia raced to the scene. Williamsburg's city council insisted that the gunpowder was the property of the colony, not the Crown, and must be returned. Dunmore claimed that he had seized the powder after he had discovered a planned slave rebellion. That was enough to mollify the crowd of Virginians, long fearful of a slave uprising. But when the crowds protested again just 2 days later, Dunmore insisted that if insult or injury were done to his person, he would declare freedom to the slaves and reduce the city of Williamsburg to ashes. He added that if the hostile environment led to battle, that he believed all the slaves would join the side of the British. On May 3rd, the Hanover militia reached Williamsburg, headed by Patrick Henry. Dunmore evacuated his family to York County, where he joined them a month later. He was eventually forced off Virginia's soil altogether, taking refuge on a British warship. A few months later, on November 7, 1775, Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation declaring martial law and called upon all able-bodied men to join him in defending the colony against the rebels. Dunmore's proclamation boldly called upon slaves belonging to colonial patriots to desert their rebellious masters and join his army, promising freedom for them all.
I do require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to His Majesty's standard or be looked upon as traitors to His Majesty's crown and government. And I do hereby further declare all indented servants, Negroes or others appertaining to rebels free that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be practical.
Within a week, over 300 slaves had escaped to enlist with Dunmore and join the Loyalist cause, doubling his loyal forces. The proclamation outraged colonials loyal to Britain as well as regular patriots. No one living in a colony with a large slave population could hear the call for what amounted to a slave revolt without feeling terror. In response, the Virginia Assembly declared that the runaway slaves faced the death penalty, but said that runaways who returned on their own would be pardoned. Dunmore organized his black loyalists into the Royal Ethiopian Regiment. They were armed, trained, and given uniforms with "Liberty to Slaves" emblazoned on their chests. The Ethiopian regiment was blooded in a skirmish with militia at Kemp's Landing, where black loyalists fought side by side with British regulars. And the Battle of Great Bridge, a few weeks later, nearly half of Dunmore's men were freed slaves. That battle was lost to the Patriots. 32 black loyalists were captured and ordered sold in the Caribbean. 800 slaves in all would respond to Dunmore's proclamation, but smallpox took its toll. When Dunmore retreated to New York in August 1776, fewer than half the Ethiopian regiment still lived. Not all British commanders were open to armed blacks fighting for Britain. But Sir Henry Clinton, who replaced Howe in May 1778, issued a proclamation even more expansive than Dunmore's. He proclaimed that all slaves belonging to Patriot owners were now free, regardless of whether they joined the British forces. This cost him some support among Southern loyalists. Tens of thousands of slaves did escape to the British. It is impossible to know the exact numbers, but Thomas Jefferson estimated that at least 30,000 Virginia slaves had run away to the British by 1778, including 30 from his own home in Monticello. It is estimated that 25,000 escaped bondage in South Carolina during the war, and another 12,000 in Georgia. Some escaped slaves did join the British forces. The largest group, and the only official black provincial unit, was the Black Pioneers. The pioneers served as scouts and performed various public works and engineering tasks, such as digging fortifications. Why would slaves choose to fight for the British, the very people who had taken them or their ancestors from Africa in the first place? How could the slaves trust British promises of freedom? The Founding Fathers should well have understood the siren song of liberty. In truth, most did recognize the evils of slavery, but they generally considered these necessary evils until the South could replace the slaves with another labor force. Leading men such as Jefferson, Franklin, and Washington had repudiated the slave trade and slavery itself and chastised Britain for forcing slaves upon the colonists in the first place, and creating a dependency of which they could not yet see their way clear. To modern ears, this can sound much like an addict blaming his addiction on the supplier. In Thomas Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence, he included a vilification of King George III for creating and sustaining the slave trade. Jefferson's fellow Southern delegates were unwilling to include that provision in the final draft, and they also opposed black soldiers fighting for the Patriot cause. During the war, the number of blacks serving in the British forces is estimated to be in the tens of thousands. On the other hand, only about 5,000 served in the Continental Army or state militias. These came mostly from northern states. Writing in 1890, Joseph T. Wilson noted,
"The love of liberty was no less strong with the Southern than with the Northern colored man, as their efforts for liberty show. At the North, he gained his freedom by entering the American Army. At the South, only by entering the British Army, which was joined by more than 15,000 colored men." Jefferson says 30,000 Negroes from Virginia alone went to the British Army. I make the digression simply to assert that had the colored men at the South possessed the same opportunity as those at the North of enlisting in the American Army, a large force of colored men would have been in the field fighting for America's independence.
Nevertheless, thousands of blacks did fight in the American forces. This was not an entirely new concept. Though regulations had prevented slaves and free blacks from joining the militia, these rules tended to be ignored during time of war. Black soldiers, free and slave, had served in the French and Indian War and other past colonial conflicts. They served as soldiers, scouts, sailors, and workers, and not in all-black units. They served next to white soldiers, generally for the same pay. In 1775, blacks were serving in northern militias, and black militiamen fought at Lexington and Concord. And one of those heroes of the Battle of Bunker Hill was the freed slave, Peter Salem. Peter Salem, the black hero of Bunker Hill, was a member of the Framingham militia, where he served for the full 7 years of the war. He was presented to General Washington in recognition of his bravery in battle. But many Southern leaders could not tolerate the idea of black men in arms. Edward Rutledge, a congressional delegate from South Carolina, demanded that all slaves and free blacks be discharged from the Continental Army. His motion was defeated, but the Continental Congress agreed to instruct Washington to take on no more black recruits. When George Washington took command of the Continental Army in Boston in July 1775, he instructed the recruiting officers to not enlist any Negro or any person who was not American-born. However, as historian George Bancroft wrote in his 1889 History of the United States,
the role of the Army at Cambridge had, from its first formation, borne the names of men of color, but as yet without legislative approval.
approved or not, black soldiers were serving, and Washington had no desire to see them go. After Lord Dunmore's proclamation in November 1775, Washington resolved to go back to Congress and request permission to recruit free blacks. Washington received word that the free Negroes who had served faithfully in the Army at Cambridge may be re-enlisted therein, but no others. But the Patriots needed men-at-arms, whatever their color. By early 1777, Washington was ready to allow the recruitment of free blacks. One witness to the use of free and enslaved black men during the war was a Hessian officer serving the British. He wrote in October 1777,
"The Negro can take the field instead of his master, and therefore no regiment is to be seen in which there are not Negroes in abundance, and among them are able-bodied, strong, and brave fellows."
But though that officer may have seen many black soldiers and surmised that some were slaves serving in the place of their masters, officially, the Continental Army was only taking free blacks. And even opening the ranks to free blacks did not bring in enough men. Black soldiers were among those half-starved and half-frozen patriots in the bitter Valley Forge winter of 1777 through 78. But the overall numbers were still too low for comfort. In January of 78, General J.M. Varnum presented to Washington a plan for raising 2 battalions of black soldiers in Rhode Island. Washington passed the idea along to the Rhode Island governor, who proposed it to the legislature. The legislature responded,
"It is voted and resolved that every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave in this state may enlist into either of the said 2 battalions to serve during the continuance of the present war with Great Britain. That every slave so enlisting shall be entitled to and receive all the bounties, wages, and encouragements allowed by the Continental Congress to any soldier enlisting in their service. It is further voted and resolved that every slave so enlisting shall, upon his passing muster, be immediately discharged from the service of his master or mistress and be absolutely free, as though he had never been encumbered with any kind of servitude or slavery."
Rhode Island even resolved that slaves should be freed, but those who became too sick to fight would still be free and would be supported at the expense of the state. Slave owners would be compensated for their loss of property. Eventually, the 1st Regiment of Rhode Island would have over 200 fighting men. They fought under Colonel Greene at the Battle of Rhode Island and were praised for their bravery and determination. Other northern states followed Rhode Island's lead, but southern states were reluctant. The Continental Congress tried to spur Georgia and South Carolina to raise an army of slaves to be commanded by white officers. Congress would compensate the masters for each slave, and the slaves would receive freedom at the end of the war. They refused. Other than Georgia and the Carolinas, the southern states did contribute black soldiers to the Patriot cause. But despite having a much higher African American population, they managed many fewer black recruits. Although southern states provided few black soldiers, they provided a significant number of black sailors. Neither the Continental Congress nor any individual state legislature forbade blacks serving in the Navy. The American Revolutionary War came to a head at the Siege of Yorktown, Virginia, in October 1781. And as they had been throughout the war, black soldiers were there on both sides of the conflict. American forces had been battling British General Cornwallis in Virginia since May. The Marquis de Lafayette shadowed Cornwallis's army, keeping just out of arm's reach. He was aided in this effort by the slave James Armistead from New Kent County, Virginia. Armistead had been given leave from his master to be Lafayette's servant. The Marquis instead turned him into a spy. In July, Armistead was hired by Cornwallis to report on the American forces. But Armistead was a double agent, keeping the Americans and their French allies informed of British plans, including Cornwallis's building of fortifications in Yorktown. Lafayette passed word to Washington, and Washington moved his army down from the north to confront Cornwallis. The Rhode Island Regiment participated in the siege of Yorktown. They served with Major General Benjamin Lincoln's division. The regiment, with over 4,000 other patriots, dug the first parallel on the evening of October 6th, less than 600 yards from the enemy. A portion of the regiment was joined with Lafayette's light infantry, and they would have witnessed Cornwallis's surrender on October 19th, 1781. With the surrender of Cornwallis, support in England for the war plummeted. Control of Parliament shifted to the Peace Party, and major military activities in North America ended. A final peace treaty would be signed in Paris on September 3rd, 1783. How did black soldiers on both sides of the conflict fare as the war came to an end? For the most part, promises of freedom made by the British or colonial governments were kept. At first, black loyalists who had served the British were terrified by the thought that they would be returned to their masters and perhaps even killed. The Treaty of Paris demanded that the British return any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants. Black loyalists based in southern states at the time of the treaty were less fortunate, and many were returned to their masters. On the American side, most promises were honored to slaves who had agreed to fight the British in exchange for freedom. Most, but not all. Some masters, men who had sent slaves to fight while they themselves stayed at home, put their Revolutionary War veterans back to work in the fields. This happened often enough that the Virginia legislature passed a law forbidding it. The American Revolution was the beginning of the end of slavery in the North. The Somerset decision in 1772 had stirred up powerful abolitionist feelings, particularly among Quakers. The language and emotions of the Declaration of Independence and the quest for liberty forced many to point to the contradiction of a land of freedom enslaving hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. And certainly, the valor of black patriots aided the cause of freedom for the nation and for slaves in the North. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 declared all men born free and equal. In a case much like Somerset's in England, the Massachusetts slave Quock Walker sued for his freedom under the state's constitution and won. Thus ended slavery in Massachusetts. Other northern states passed emancipation laws that went into effect quickly or gradually, depending on the state. In many cases, slavery would be replaced by bitter racial prejudices. But one thing was clear. The North took the view that the war had made it a place of freedom, while the South believed that the war had secured its right to maintain the institution of slavery. In 1787, as the delegates to the Constitutional Convention met to develop the Constitution that would eventually be the foundation of the United States government, slavery was a major topic of consideration. Delegates from the northern states, which were already in the process of ending slavery, were opposed to the practice. Delegates from the South, among whom were large plantation holders, saw slavery as a necessary evil, essential to their region's production. The issue was of particular concern when deciding how to determine each state's representation in the federal government. Delegates from the South, where slaves represented about 40% of the population, wanted slaves to count as citizens when determining a state's representation. This would mean that the number of representatives a state could send to Congress would be based on the size of their total population, including slaves. But since slaves themselves would have no vote, this would give white voters in the South a disproportionately high level of representation. Further, when taxes were to be determined based on population size, the South wanted slaves to be considered property, not persons. The Northern delegates considered this a twisted logic designed to benefit Southern planters at the expense of Northern citizens. Eventually, a compromise was reached. A slave would count as 3/5 of a person when determining both representation and taxation. The convention also dealt with the issue of the Atlantic slave trade. Every state except Georgia and the Carolinas had banned the importation of slaves from across the Atlantic. But those 3 southern states still required high levels of importation in order to maintain their workforces. Virginia and Maryland, on the other hand, saw that their slave population was growing naturally by reproduction, and no new imports were needed. In fact, these states would benefit from a restriction on international slave trade, as it would make their own slaves more valuable, and they could sell excess slaves to the Deep South. Eventually, another compromise was reached. It was agreed that the international slave trade would continue another 20 years, and that Congress could then end the trade beginning in 1808. A third major item in the Constitution with regard to slavery is the third clause of Article 4.
No person held in service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due.
Although it did not use the term slave, the point of this clause was to protect the property rights of slave owners in the event that slaves escaped to a free state. A few years later, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 would strengthen this clause by making it a crime to assist a runaway and allow slave catchers to operate in all the states and territories. At the same time as the delegates were meeting in Philadelphia on the Constitution, the Continental Congress, still operating under the Articles of Confederation, was meeting in New York. Their most important product was the Northwest Ordinance, which detailed how new territories would be opened up for the American expansion. Article 6 of the ordinance stated that there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. This outlawed slavery in these Northwest territories. Southern planters were actually pleased with this decision, as they feared that if those territories were open to slave-based plantations, they would provide too much competition in cash crops, such as tobacco. The American Revolution was about liberty. In practice, it was more about the liberty of whites than blacks, but the Revolution nevertheless had a powerful impact on slavery in America. Individual slaves were given the opportunity to fight for their freedom. In the North, they were given the opportunity to join the Patriot cause and earn freedom by protecting American liberty. In the South, where several states refused to consider arming slaves, those potential patriots instead escaped their bondage to fight for the promise of freedom offered by the British. After the war, revolutionary ideals and a new abolitionist movement inspired by the Somerset decision in England led to the eventual emancipation of all slaves in northern states, though more quickly in some states than others. In the South, Southern planters felt that they had successfully defended their way of life, slavery, against the looming threat of parliamentary interference. They had no intention of letting the new government of the United States become a new threat to their means of economic production. The new Constitution denigrated slaves by counting each as less than a whole person. But it set an end date to the international trade in slaves. And the Congress sectioned off an enormous territory and declared that this portion of land should be forever free. In many ways, it seemed as if slavery might fade away in coming decades, as more citizens began to think that the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness should belong to slaves as well as free whites. But a technological marvel was less than a decade from being invented. The cotton gin would breathe new life into this peculiar institution, providing one more roadblock on our path up from slavery.
Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. My Lord, He calls me. He calls me by the thunder. The trumpet sounds within my soul. I ain't got long